I am here. My headphones have stopped working, so we're now on my. So you may get background noise from the streets of Denmark. But I mean, Allan, thank you so much for that. I just wondered. I was really taken in by your this image of you walking along the street back from Morrison's, and getting the structure of the book. And I wonder if we could start there, and you could tell us a bit more about the process, because I know, I'm an author myself, and I had one way of writing a book, but I mean, there are probably people on the call who'd really love to know about the process you followed for this one.
Sure. That's a good question. And I sort of worked out as I went along. I'd never written a book before, although I'd done quite a lot of writing. And then the funny thing about writing this book is, obviously you use your imagination in writing. So I'm writing about the subject that I'm using to write about the subject. So it was a process. The structure was get up every day and write for 3 or 4 hours for 2 years. And at the end of it, you have a book, and a lot of blood, sweat and tears along the way. So inspiration is important, but I think don't wait for it to come. You need to create a routine and a habit, which invites in the ideas, which invites in the solutions to the questions that you're asking. I mean, I got invited to write the book by Stacey Millichamp at Transpersonal Press. And I thought, I got a bit of an idea. If I draw upon my teaching notes, so I'd been writing seminars for a while and writing articles, and I thought there was a basis there. So I looked at what I'd written before, I sketched out a plan, and then you just get stuck, and then you realize you don't have answers, and you have a lot of questions. And then the book doesn't go where you want it to go, and then you fight that, and then you realize you can't fight that, and you need to just run with what's emerging. So it's kind of like you're not really in control of the process. That's another important thing. And learning to let go and listen to where the book wants to go is a really important step. Maybe that'll do for now, but it's like the book's alive.
Yeah.
And you're a midwife.
Yeah.
And every day I wrote, and every day to a greater or lesser extent I thought, I can't do this. Who do you think you are? This is shit. Stop, run away. And it's very stressful, and I could have given up many times, but that's never gone away. But you get better at not buying into that undermining voice, that wants to limit you and hold you back. So that's writing.
I'll just say, I think we're all glad you cracked on with it and you didn't give in to that voice. So thank you for bringing the book into the world. I was really struck by, more than struck, fascinated by the comparison you did between the mechanical and the ecological, chapter 7, chapter 9. And it feels really important to perhaps draw a bit more out about that. Could you do that?
Sure. Quite early on in my therapy training, I intuitively didn't like the idea of parts. It's a real shorthand, that part of you. So for example, we'd have some kind of exercise and the image would be that a part of me. And, that's fine. And it's useful if you want to think about images. But the actual experience was of not meeting a part of me. It was of meeting a lion, of meeting a witch, of meeting a dragon. And then it gets turned into a part of me. So it always seemed a reductive move or a slightly distancing language. And then I joined that up to Freud's big metaphor in his thinking, the mind as machine metaphor. So his psychodynamics, which is a big thing in therapy to this day, 100 years later, is based on thermodynamics. So the machine technology of Freud's day, the steam engine. So you can't measure the psyche, you can't weigh the psyche, you can't see the psyche. So you need to come up with a metaphor to describe it and to think about it. So one of his main explanatory metaphors was the steam engine. Essentially, the psyche is, as it were, a container, a vessel, a machine, the unconscious, within which there is steam, not water molecules, but feelings, thoughts, memories clashing around, interacting under pressure, exerting forces against each other. And these are the parts, like the pistons and the drive shaft. And the therapeutic method and the idea of change is one of a release valve within which pent up stuff in the unconscious needs to come into the light of awareness, into consciousness. So I was looking around for an alternative because intuitively I knew that imagination wasn't a machine. And so in two regards, ecotherapy really helped me out there. So there's a few, it's like the sensory element of imagining. I just knew that after spending time outside, my imagination was enhanced. And I could see that that overlapped with a very similar experience in novel reading, for example, because novel reading takes you into your senses. And then after reading a novel, you notice the world more. So it was a sense of being in a landscape, of being a sensuous animal, and being in a place, not inside a machine or not looking at a machine, but wandering on safari. And then I got really excited. I was in a hotel room in Jura in the Hebrides online. And I read about that there's some psychotherapists drawing upon complexity theory, this thing called complexity theory, which is how physics understands change these days, and integrating that into therapeutic understanding. And complexity theory is a metaphor, but the metaphors are drawn not from mechanical paradigms like steam engines, they're drawn from the natural world. Originally from weather patterns, but also they're used like heartbeats, traffic flows. I mean, that's not the natural world, but so I learned about that, and that was very exciting. And then I saw an alignment to the change process. This, because I'm talking about imagining as a healing and transformative process in itself. And what complexity theory does is it shines a light on the processes active in transformation. It's quite exciting. It's basically about bringing together the image as a whole rather than breaking it down into parts. Yeah, how's that?
Yeah, I think it's great, and I'm sure people have more questions about that.
Yeah, we could go back to that.
For me, you know, there's a really radical act involved in making the move towards complexity and ecological away from mechanical. You know, and in that, it's a radical book, and it's very much of its time, because lots of fields are moving that way. And as far as I'm aware, this is the first book to do that in relation to imagination. Yeah. So, but you've seized on the very contemporary in respect of ecological and complexity thinking, but you've also tackled the historic and the classical here. You've brought together thinking about psyche, imagination, and soul, and the relationship between these three big ideas, and you've placed them in the historical context. But I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how this has allowed you to offer something into the contemporary, into the contemporary context of what I think in the book you call the mystical influences of psychosynthesis and broader transpersonal work.
I'll try and do that succinctly. That's a good question. So soul, psyche, these are big terms, and in modern times, they've been thought of as personal and subjective. And we think of our personal soul or my soul. We might even picture it as a little homunculus that lives inside us. Similarly, with the psyche, we think of a personal, subjective psyche. However, in pre-modern times, going back to the Greek and further back into indigenous times, soul and psyche, which is the same term, I always get them mixed up. One's Greek, one's Latin. So the original conception and usage of both soul and psyche wasn't as a subjective inner event, and neither was it an objective external thing out there. It was a third category that existed between self and world. It was a kind of a zone of porous exchange that mediated our contact with other. So life was there was more of a blurred line between self and world, between subject and object, and that allowed and the world wasn't as neatly divided up into objective facts and subjective fantasies. Now, if we fast so if we fast forward, as you've very kindly framed the book, I mean, most contemporary developments are looking to the breakdown of that artificial separation between subject and object, self and world, and how to think about that in a much more malleable or fluid fashion. And if you go back, if you think about the mystical traditions, so which psychosynthesis, so we're here under the auspices of the Psychosynthesis Trust. So Roberto Saggioli, one of who invented psychosynthesis, an early transpersonal therapist, drew upon mystical inspirations, and mystical traditions are essentially, like I say, those that blur self and world. But he was writing in the mid-20th century at a time when empirical science was hegemonic. And so he had to pitch this mystical tradition within the framework of a science of inner subjectivity, which is a real shame, because you kind of, as I go into in the book, it kind of doesn't make sense, because the various experiences that he's talking about blur the line between self and world. Like if you're out in nature all day and by the end of your walk, you just feel much less in your head and worrying about your emails and work, and you feel joined up to the trees and the bird and the sky. So in a small way, that's a mystical experience. It's not inside you, and neither is it just subjective. It includes the subjective, but it also is a participation in a surrounding event or environment. So by going back to that pre-modern understanding of psyche and soul, and joining that up with the complexity theory that I've mentioned, but also quantum physics and other ideas that break down and move away from the hegemony of empiricism, which is a really kind of dualistic way of thinking, we can gain legitimacy, if you like, in contemporary life for the mystical. We don't need to hide it away or dress it up as a subjective thing to gain credence. We can put it in the shop window and call it what it is, and therefore, as I say in the book, validate, notice, and enhance it. And I talk about that in the last chapter as a transpersonal imagination.
Well, that I suppose, you know, I see this as being in some ways similar to the work of somebody like Stephen Harding, who's the deep ecologist at Schumacher College. He wrote a book called Animate Earth, and you know, very different field to yours, but talking about the same imperative of, you know, not falling into mechanical and not falling into a world of imagination being entirely inner as opposed to an outer, but you know, but there being, you know, a combination of these, a meeting, and that made me think of the fact that this critique of inner and personal imagination runs right through the book, and you know, it strikes me there's a wider social relevance to this that's reflected in lots of fields, and I wonder, could I ask you to say, you know, something about how you feel this book and that principle that you've put at the heart of it might say something about the contemporary crises we face, of which there's quite a lot.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in I'm glad you've asked me that, because there's a quote that I wanted to read out, which isn't in the book, but I wish it was. It's from Annie Lebrun. She's a French essayist. And she says, "The assault by the modern world on dream and imagination is a calamity that, while seemingly minor in appearance, is in fact the greatest problem of all, because it makes possible all the other devastations threatening our world today." The assault
Alan, yeah, one more time, I think, for that.
The assault by the modern world on dream and imagination. So the premise in the book is that our imaginations are being stripped bare, run down. We're being jangled by social media, by alienating environments, by economic pressures, pushing us into a narrow, frustrated fantasy life. So the assault by the modern world on dream and imagination is a calamity. It might seem minor in appearance, but actually, if you think about it, it's what makes all the other devastations threatening our world today makes them happen. Because, I mean, I guess what I'd like to think the book can do, or offers a step towards, is the enhancement of imagining in and of itself. Because there's lots of ideas about how to make the world a better place. I've certainly got lots of ideas about how to make my life a better life, but whether or not they actually get rolled out into action is a whole other thing. And what the book presents is the imaginative bridge that can take us from ideas into actions.
Yeah.
It's like imagination is the home of intentionality. And without the ability to picture, to conceive of possibilities, which is a nice way of understanding what imagination is, we will go with the flow. We will repeat and do what we've always done, or what's easiest. So I think in whatever field we're in, and however we're trying to affect change and improve things and act against all the various crises within and without, we need a healthy imaginative life. We need to protect it. And I guess what the book does in that regard is, if you're going to protect something, you need to know what it is, right? And you need to be able to notice it, and you need to know what undermines it, and practices that you can roll out to keep it healthy and alive. So that I think that's the broad pitch there.
Yeah, and you know,
I mean, I would have loved to have gone into that more, and you know, there's always another book, but maybe I'll leave other people to make those connections.
Yeah, well, you know, for me, it feels like it's you know, it's contemporary and it's essential, and it's quite a radical act. So there you are, you've written a book, and I'm just thinking, yeah, so what next? I mean, you said another book, but I mean, I've got a feeling that there's something much more. You know, it's not just another book. I mean, what else are you doing with this?
Well, the great thing about writing a book is it's a bit like writing an essay, but more. It's like these ideas are in me now, and I've really grown into the book, or the book's grown into me. So I just want to get on and be imaginative. That's the main thing. How am I going to do that is the question, and I'm going to continue to teach at the Psychosynthesis Trust. But I've put together a little online course starting in January based on the book. And the idea is to find some compadres, some colleagues, students, I suppose, to continue on the journey and to explore the material. But you know, I'm continuing to learn, and there's lots of things that I'm coming up with and noticing that I think, oh, I could put that in the book. And I'm continuing to read around the subject and thinking, oh, that really fleshes that out nicely. So I want to have a home and a context to build on that. And I'm resisting writing another book because I was just driving myself mad. I was just in a momentum when I finished this book, and I just kept carrying on. And I stopped, but there will be a time when I probably start again.
Oh, good for you. But you know, we really should open this to everybody for questions very shortly. But I just want to ask. So you mentioned this program or course you're going to run. I mean, how do people find out about it? Where do they go?
Oh, that's sweet. It's under the auspices of the Psychosynthesis Trust. So if you log on to the Psychosynthesis Trust website, you can also find out about it on my website, which is wildimagination.uk. There's also a little evening that I'm doing in October that will flesh out the book a bit more than this, a bit more experiential,
fantastic,
try it out type things. Yeah.
Okay, and people can find all of that on the Trust website as well as your own.